Um, Thank you very much for coming today to this briefing. The 63rd session of the Commission on the Status of Women is less than 2 weeks away. It starts on Monday, March the 11th, and it goes to March the 22nd here at UNHQ, as many of you in the room know. The Commission was established in 1946 to promote gender equality and women's empowerment in UNEs. Its mandate is to prepare recommendations on promoting women's rights in political, economic, civil, social, and educational fields. The Commission on the Status of Women is also a time to review the progress made, identify the challenges which lay ahead, and set global standards. It's the largest, as I know many of you know, annual gathering of gender equality advocates, women's rights advocates in the world. More than 9,000 people are expected to take part in this year's session. And joining me today here in the UN Correspondents Association room are two guests who know the CSW very well. Have intimate knowledge of its processes, negotiations, and outcomes. They thought, and UNCA agreed, that this might be a good time to give you a little curtain raiser on what to look out for this year. What will be the big topics, the controversies, the trends, and what resolutions may be adopted. So without further ado, Rachel Jacobson at the end, the one in the white jacket, the pregnant belly, is a program officer with the International Women's Health Coalition, IWHC, which is a New York-based NGO which advances sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls, particularly adolescents around the world. Rachel's focus is on the engagement of UN member states during CSW and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Next to me, Jessica Stern is Executive Director of OutRight Action International, an NGO which fights for human rights for LGBTIQ people around the world in 7 countries. And OutRight is actually the only organization with a permanent presence here at the UN in New York, focused on advocating for the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, and transgender people. Maybe we could start with you, Rachel, about what some of the things are that we should be looking out for this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. As you heard, I'm Rachel Jacobson. I'm a program officer for international policy at IWHC, and for the past 35 years, IWHC has been working to advance sexual and reproductive health and rights globally. And one of the main ways we do that is through engagement in international negotiations, especially here at the UN. And as you heard, the Commission, or CSW, as we call it, is one of the biggest moments of the year for us as IWHC, because it is the single largest gathering dedicated exclusively to women's human rights. And for the past few years, what we've really been seeing globally is, I would say, an increase in the power and engagement of women's civil society and women's movements globally. We've seen a lot of push for change at all different levels, at the same time that we're seeing a reduction of space for civil society, and we're seeing crackdowns on civil society, and really deliberate attempts to roll back commitments to women's human rights. And CSW for me is the global space where that tension plays out. As you heard, we have over 9,000 people that registered to attend the CSW this year, and that does not include the government delegations, right? So and government delegations, sometimes they're very small. There can be 3 people. Sometimes they're as large as 100 people. So this is just 9,000 women's human rights activists that come to New York for these 2 weeks, because the CSW is such an important space for us to push our governments to make the commitments to women's human rights and to hold them accountable then when we return home. I really like to think of CSW as the space where we get to take the temperature of political support for women's human rights. It's a chance for governments to, on a global stage, make commitments to women's human rights, show what they're willing to support, and how they see women's human rights. It is one of the most widely watched, attended, and participated in commissions that the UN has. And this year, the focus of the commission, it's going to be on social protection, access to public services, and sustainable infrastructure. And that's a really new theme for the commission to consider, with really significant implications for gender equality and for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, for IWHC in particular, one of our key priorities is around universal health coverage, both at UHC as a measure of social protection, but also in terms of access to public services. And for us, it's really important that we see comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care services within the package of UHC services that governments provide, that we have commitments to health as a human right, and also that UHC programs really address the full range of barriers that women and girls have when they're trying to access health systems. And that can include women's limited autonomy and decision-making power to seek health services in the first place, the debilitating impact of out-of-pocket payments for health services, and also just the outright abuse and discrimination that exists within all of our health systems. So while this theme is fairly new for the commission to take on, I think that some of the flashpoints in the negotiations are going to be well known. The negotiations began this week, and we've already heard, for example, the U.S. stating that they're not willing to accept any reference to sexual and reproductive health or reproductive rights. And so even in the absence of leadership at US-UN, we're expecting that the US will continue attacking these basic concepts as well as a range of other ones that are important for gender equality broadly, as they've been doing for the past few years, and in particular, I would say ramping up in the past 6 months. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention. Happy to answer more questions and go into more detail during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Jessica, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you to the UN Correspondents Association for having us here today. I wanted to first explain why the CSW is important to LGBTIQ people globally. The facts are pretty straightforward. More than 70 countries globally criminalize homosexuality, and countless more criminalize so-called cross-dressing or impersonation, or have criminalizing laws on transgender people and people who are gender non-conforming. So coming to the international level and seeking recognition for the true diversity of our community is absolutely paramount. But the CSW has a particular political significance in the UN system for LGBTIQ activists. So you might ask, has the Human Rights Council said anything about LGBTI rights? And the answer is yes. There have been 3 successive resolutions on LGBTI rights at the Human Rights Council, and there are literally hundreds of references in the context of the Universal Periodic Review. Of course, we also have references to sexual orientation and gender identity at the General Assembly, and that comes in the form of a biannual resolution condemning extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions. And believe it or not, we've even gotten reference to sexual orientation from the Security Council. And so all of the major institutions, political and legal, of the UN system have found that discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity are antithetical to the UN's purpose. But do you know what body has never used the word sexual orientation or gender identity? The CSW. And I think that we have to ask ourselves, what is it that's so dangerous about the intersections between women's rights and LGBTI rights, that in this particular space, the twain never shall meet? And so I want to put it in a historical perspective. I want to remind you that 2 years ago, there was a real attack on LGBTI rights that came from members of the US delegation to the UN, and that was the participation of CFAM and the Heritage Foundation in the official state delegation. These are 2 organizations that are known hate groups. They've basically called for conversion therapy, electroshock therapy, and other forms of dehumanization of LGBTI people. Last year on the US delegation to the CSW, we had US government officials like Bethany Kozma, who are notorious leaders campaigning against all transgender rights, and she's particularly notorious for her track record targeting transgender school children. In this context, what are LGBTIQ people asking for from this? Be looking for? Well, I'm really sorry to say that I think we're going to see more attacks on transgender people at the CSW this year than maybe any prior year in the CSW's history. I think it's a direct backlash to the success of transgender people globally, making their needs known. I also think it's inspired by the political opportunities that have been created by states that have not stood in solidarity with transgender people and have had banned them from military service, made their access to public facilities like bathrooms inaccessible. And we see this in the program of side events across the CSW. There are at least 8 separate events that I counted that explicitly are attacking LGBTIQ people at the CSW. And there's one that's really quite evil. That is a panel that aspires to put women and girls back at the center of gender equality policies. And the description says, as you know, real women and girls are being overshadowed by the transgender agenda. For anyone who's not familiar with the statistics, the reason why we talk about transgender people so much in the context of human rights is because of the disproportionately high levels of violence they experience. Notably, violence against transgender women is shocking. And you can look at really good statistics from the TGEU, which manages something called the Transgender Murder Monitoring Project, which literally tracks thousands of killings of transgender people just for being who they are. I want to just mention very quickly OutRight's priorities. I think at the CSW we're all anxious because there's been a weakening of political support from some of the traditional allies and leaders for women's rights and LGBTI rights. And so we have been reading the draft agreed conclusions. We see a number of negative insertions across the text. The Holy See is very visible and very aggressive in trying to criminalize diverse forms of the family. It's very unfortunate the Holy See is taking that position, especially when it has so much work to do internally on child sexual abuse. But particular concerns for OutRight are unnecessary insertions to the family instead of to diverse forms of the family. We all have families. Queer women have families too. We want all of our families to be seen. We're concerned about a redlining of the word gender. Gender is accepted language across the United Nations. It's also accepted language across national constitutions and many jurisdictions of UN member states. There's no reason whatsoever to redline gender. We're concerned about the need to recognize women human rights defenders. As Rachel was saying, it is really hard to be doing civil society work right now, and if the CSW has value and relevance, then it needs to be clear in its support of women human rights defenders. And finally, I would say we want language on diversity. There are many ways to be a woman, and we want states to take recognition of that. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thanks. Maybe I'll start off with one question. As we see that, conservative views are gaining momentum around the world. As journalists, we see that as well. And there are different organizations, different ways to try to combat that. I'm wondering, with your organizations and here at the CSW, fighting for fundamental rights, I'm wondering how this trend has evolved. You've both been here for many years, how you've seen this trend evolve. And specifically, I'm wondering about the United States, which I mean, in the last 2 years has been sort of characterized as one of the most aggressive and regressive players at the table. And I'm wondering how much of an impact you think that is having on other states and their views on women's rights, gender rights. Rachel?
Do you want to start? Or
Jessica?
Sure, I can start.
Okay.
How have conservative views gained momentum globally? I wish I knew the answer. If there was one answer, I can tell you I would divert everything that we have into that area particularly. But I would say that it certainly the increasing amount of hateful rhetoric from political leaders has a huge impact in telling their populations what kind of behavior is and is not acceptable. And of course, in all the jurisdictions where heads of state, high-ranking ministers have made anti-woman or anti-LGBTI statements, you see a corresponding increase in violence targeting those people. The second thing I want to say is about the impact of the U.S. on other states. As many of you may be aware, there's always a question at the CSW about whether there will actually be an agreed conclusion. The agreed conclusion is the intended outcome document of the CSW. And there certainly should be an agreed conclusion this year. I mean, we can all agree that women's rights have never been a more important topic of global discussion. With the Me Too movement, we have all been watching the revelations of workplace harassment and abuse of women globally. And so it would be a real shame if there wasn't an agreed conclusions this year. I think that the U.S. will play a determining role in whether or not that happens, because if there isn't normative progress, or if we don't at least hold the line of what we had at prior CSWs, many states and many of us from civil society will be reluctant to see an agreed conclusions go into effect. So I certainly hope the U.S. does the right thing.
Yeah, to maybe even put an optimistic spin on it. I think it was interesting last year for the Commission on the Status of Women, we had a lot of the same concerns that we have this year. I mean, the same political forces that we've described so far were happening last year. And yet, in the agreed conclusions were adopted by consensus, which is traditionally how the Commission on the Status of Women works, unlike other resolutions and other agreements in the UN system that get voted on. CSW is traditionally a space for consensus. And really unprecedented in last year in terms of the negotiations was the fact that every country that participates in the negotiations, which by the way the regional groups work is almost every country is represented really in those negotiations, agreed to the outcome in the room. There wasn't this negotiation, it's not a tactic exactly, but a practice that had been happening in years before in the CSW is the negotiations would reach a certain point where there'd be some deadlock or some impasse, and then the chair of the commission would come forward with a text and say, this is kind of take it or leave it. If you want an outcome, this is what it's going to be. And last year, that isn't what happened. We actually had every country in that room agreeing in the room to say, yes, we can support that. And that included language on diversity, which was really impressive that I don't think we really thought we were going to get last year. It included language on sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights as human rights. Like it had really substantial language in there, and there was that consensus. And I think what that showed a lot of us is that where there is a political will and political pressure, which I think is what the CSW has because it is such a high-profile commission, because heads of state and high-level ministers come to CSW, there's pressure there. And that pressure really pushes countries to say, you know, we're posturing a little bit about what we can and cannot accept. And actually, we are willing to talk about diversity of all women and girls. We are willing to talk about reproductive rights. And so what we'll have to see is, does that pressure to have an outcome, will that maintain this year? And I would say also on the U.S., you know, it was interesting to see what happened during the third committee of the General Assembly and to see what kind of resistance the U.S. put up to a wide range of issues. I mean, I in particular follow, sexual and reproductive rights, but it's true for trade, it's true for climate change, it's true for financing. As what we saw was that the U.S. wasn't able to build alliances and build consensus and really marshal a kind of broad cross-regional group of countries to lead opposition to that. And so we'll have to see if the U.S. is interested in doing that and able to do that, or if it, again, is about the political posturing, the ability to send a message to, especially to a domestic audience, about what those positions are. So I think that there's a way, there is a way to get a good outcome this year, even in the midst of the kinds of negative political forces that we're describing that are quite real, and not to minimize those at all.
Maybe we'll open the floor up to questions. Yeah. Carole, and if possible, if you could say your name and your media organization.
Hi, I'm Carol Landry with Agence France Presse, AFP. I just wanted to understand, what are the ramifications of not having agreement on an outcome document? What happens? How does this affect women's rights?
Yeah, no, let's do it one at a time, because then it sort of gets lost. Yeah.
Sure. So I think a couple things. And so one is that next year is the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And that is, one of the most significant international agreements that we have on women's human rights. I would say, right up there with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And so there's a sense in which I think that this CSW is important as an expression of political commitment to women's human rights the year before the anniversary. I think also the outcome is important for the health of the commission as a whole. That there are other commissions within the UN system where we've seen what happens when there isn't an agreement year after year after year. And you see a diminishing in the political importance of that commission. You see a diminishment in the importance of the agencies that work to support that commission. And you see that the issues that commission deals with lower in importance on kind of the UN radar. So I think that, even more than any direct impact that no outcome would have on policy decisions that a country makes, I think it's more about the level of support for women's rights within the UN system in general, and kind of that sense of keeping women's rights high on the global political agenda. I don't know for you, Jess.
I would just add very briefly that it makes states look out of touch. I mean, we know we're all talking about violence and discrimination against women. It's a global conversation, and if states can't reach basic agreements that violence and discrimination against women is bad, it was bad last year, it was bad the year before, and it's still bad this year, then it makes them look like they're not paying attention to domestic debates. And unfortunately, it actually removes a very powerful resource from the toolbox of local advocates who are often fighting in jurisdictions where they don't have strong laws on violence and discrimination against women and girls.
It happened before, though. It did in 2013, 2012. It was when the theme was on rural women and girls. So last year's theme was rural women and girls, and then the last time there weren't agreed conclusions was when that was considered, which was 2012 or 2013.
And the outcome document is used as a tool, right? For people around the world, they use it to go back and lobby their own governments, right? Policy experts, activists use it to say, look, the UN has come out with this document, so it's to change.
Absolutely.
So without that.
Absolutely, and it helps guide UN women's work. It helps guide just the general advancement of our global norms.
Evelyn Leopold, Independent Media. Rachel, could you slowly repeat what are the main goals of this? And Jessica, I'm surprised the U.S. doesn't get more support for anti-gay LGBT stands, because it seems that the majority of states discriminate.
Sorry, did you mean more support? Can you just say your question again?
I'm surprised that anything gets in on LGBT, because of the majority of the states in the world discriminate. and they will all be there. So I'm amazed that they even get anything into the document. And then, Rachel, can you repeat slowly the
Sure.
main thing?
The priorities for
What
my
the main goals of the conference are this year?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I can go first. So CSW, the annual theme is on social protection, access to public services, and sustainable infrastructure. And then within that, IWHC in particular, we work around health systems and universal health coverage. So we have particular things we want to see governments make commitments to when it comes to how to create and implement UHC programs, including having sexual and reproductive health care services within a package of services for UHC, having health embedded in UHC programs as a human right, and also addressing the full range of barriers that women and girls have when it comes to accessing a health system. So it's things like out-of-pocket payments, discrimination and abuse from healthcare workers themselves, as well as just decision-making to be able to go and seek healthcare services.
What was that on infrastructure again?
Sustainable infrastructure.
Whatever
and
that means. Yeah.
So transportation systems, water and sanitation, energy and electricity in particular. And the theme really is also about how those three elements build on and reinforce one another, right? So you can't have, so thinking about transportation and health systems, right? One of the biggest problems that women and girls in rural areas have is being able to get to a health system in the first place. So you need a transportation system that's going to be able to connect them to the health service, that's affordable, that's safe, right? So the theme is really looking at how each of those three pieces come together and can either support gender equality in achieving the SDGs or make it even harder.
Thank you for your question, Evelyn. Nothing has ever gotten in on LGBTI rights, so you're right to think that's a dream that we're still working towards. Since we haven't gotten explicit references to the term sexual orientation, gender identity, or sex characteristics into the text, it's really important to see progress in terms of other forms of recognition. And so last year we were very pleased to see language on intersectionality and diversity strengthened within the text. And the term of art in the agreed conclusions is multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. And it was articulated across the document last year. And that was a win not only for LGBTI people, but to women across the range of forms of expression. Last year also probably had the most progressive acknowledgement of civil society and especially women's human rights defenders in recent years. And this is really important from an LGBTI perspective because when you can't change laws and policies, you have to work on change through other levers. And civil society is the number one factor, LGBTI civil society is the number one predictor of safety and security for LGBTI people globally. So where there are LGBTI organizations, you're more likely to have LGBTI safety. You're more likely to have cultural acceptance, and you're more likely to have law and policy reform. So when we see strong language on civil society, that's a win. And I would just say that, last year's text was really great because it had violence in it throughout. I mean, how can you talk about the well-being of women of the world without talking about the levels of violence that we live with? And so seeing that language strong is a win. And I would just go back to this issue of families. Unfortunately at the CSW, the concept of family is often treated as though recognizing diverse forms of families actually is a secret way of getting to recognizing gay families. And this is a huge mistake. If you don't recognize diverse forms of the family, then you don't recognize the potential for divorce. You don't recognize the potential for sisters to live together and raise their kids together. You don't recognize grandparents that live with their children. So we haven't yet gotten to explicit reference to LGBTI issues, but we can make a lot of progress by just recognizing the ways that people are targeted in these other categories.
That's very interesting. Do we have other questions?
Hi, I'm Dulcie from Pass Blue. I had a couple of questions, but I just wanted to ask you about last year's outcome document and the sort of final hours. It seemed to me that it was able to get through because there were sort of more of us versus them, ultimately numbers. And what do you know that the U.S. delegation is planning to do this year? Who is going to lead the delegation, and what is their focus, and who is in the delegation? Thanks.
So I think specifically on the delegation, that, as far as I know, has not been announced yet. It's typically announced about a week before the CSW starts, so I can't speak to what's on the delegation. I think, though, that that I'm not sure I would characterize it as a numbers game from last year. I genuinely think that what we saw in the negotiation was good faith attempts to find consensus. And that it was a theme that was very important to a really wide range of delegations, and that we saw people, we saw governments taking actions to say, you know what, this theme is important. CSW is important to us. It's not about scoring the political points, right? So I think that you saw that kind of camaraderie is not the right word, but cooperation in the room, right? Like the commitment to consensus that CSW has had. I think you saw that play out. So I'm not sure I would say it was a numbers game or an us versus them. I think that really you saw, solutions coming from lots of different governments who were saying, okay, I recognize that this is a priority for you. Let me find a way to let me find language that will make it acceptable for me to take that. And so that's kind of what I saw play out.
Was that unusual or?
I would say last year, I think that the level of cooperation was higher than what I've seen in previous years. Because I think there was a sense that there's a danger in no outcome, and governments didn't want that. And I think that pushed people to increase their cooperation.
I just want to say it's so nice to meet someone from Pass Blue. I'm a huge fan, an avid reader. So last year, the U.S. delegation was announced the Friday before the CSW started on Monday, so I'm not surprised that it hasn't come out yet. Mm-hmm. But when it was announced, it was incredibly and intentionally vague. Last year, it was not a listing of names. You might remember there were references to U.S. Government agencies listed. So I think at best, that's what we would get again this year. We don't know whether or not there will be public delegates on the U.S. delegation. And so, we're at a bit of a disadvantage, of course, because we don't know what technical skills the U.S. will have helping to inform its positions. There's two things that we want at a minimum. Well, there's like 2,000 things we want, but I'm going to name two. We want people with relevant technical expertise on the delegation. Whoever is sitting on the delegation on behalf of the U.S. has a seat at a very important table. Rachel and I have been coming to the CSW forever. We don't have access to the negotiating room. Mm-hmm. So it's really important that whoever's on that delegation actually knows the themes relevant to the CSW, mm-hmm. and it's just not some, gift to a political fundraiser. The second thing I want to say is that with regard to the U.S., there was one instance last year where a member of the U.S. delegation attempted to invent U.S. policy in the negotiating room. And some of you may recall there was a member of the U.S. delegation who had expressed during negotiations that the U.S. is a pro-life nation. Of course, a very basic demand we have is that U.S. policy and law is not invented in the negotiating room, that actually U.S. law and policy is respected in all the U.S. positions.
Actually, could I get a brief follow-up on that? You mentioned the Holy See earlier, and you mentioned political fundraisers and gifts, and I'm wondering if, in the time that you have been here, you've seen a sort of a shift in the types of topics that are discussed, the types of organizations that take part, and whether you're seeing more funding for conservative groups to, if you're up against the money as well, coming to CSW. Maybe, maybe not, I'm not sure. I looked at my emails before coming in. I only had something from the Holy See. Just on CSW, so.
Do you want to share your email
No,
address here?
I'm just wondering if you're noticing that
Yeah.
that's one of the trends, that there is more money or more topics on conservative or regressive issues
Yeah.
here at CSW. Yeah? I don't know, maybe.
I can answer anecdotally. And anecdotally, I would say yes, absolutely. I mean, there's been a definite shift where some of the right-wing fundamentalist organizations have started focusing on the UN even more than in the past. So, for example, if you read the most recent annual report from the Heritage Foundation, and I swear I don't work for them, this is not an intentional advertisement for them, but, they have a $50 million plus annual budget, and they announce an explicit expansion of their international operations, and a high priority is placed on work at the United Nations. They're very explicit that this is a space where they see power and decisions being made, and so they're going to be here following what's happening.
Yeah, and I would say, I don't know how many side events there are total for CSW, something like 600, 800. So it would be difficult for me to answer that to answer your question with any degree of accuracy. But I would say that certainly for the Holy See, that participating in negotiations about gender equality has been of primary importance since the big UN conferences in the mid-90s, since Vienna, when we first had women's rights as human rights, since the Cairo International Conference on Population and Development, when we had reproductive rights as human rights really called out for the first time, and then certainly since Beijing in 1995. That, since those big conferences where we got some really fundamental advances and recognition of the full range of women's human rights, the Holy See has been incredibly actively engaged in trying to ensure that certain elements of a broad gender equality agenda don't continue to make advances, and whether or not that's recognition that gender only means that there's biological men and biological women, to ensuring that reproductive rights doesn't really get, that it's all constantly contested. It's been a political priority for them since then.
Do we have any more? Oh.
Just as Joe Vaccarello from Al Jazeera, just as a counter to Melissa's question, in terms of that, conservative groups, the U.S. has been the deep, dark opposition. Do you see regions or specific countries that have been actually in recent years more supportive and really opening up to your causes?
So new allies versus traditional allies, kind of?
So I think it all waxes and wanes with the political environment in general. And so I think that it's been interesting, Jessica, I don't know if you'd agree with this, to see Latin America in particular, right? That I think that there was a period in time where there's real progressive support for human rights in general in Latin America, and then in particular around some LGBT issues and on women's rights. And you see that because, social movements are incredibly powerful in Latin America, and in particular women's movements and LGBT movements, very, very powerful. And so we'd seen real allies from Latin America and wanting to step up and take leadership, and wanting to step up and make their positions known. There's been a series of elections in Latin America, as I'm sure you all know, where you've seen more conservative parties coming in and leading. And so it'll be interesting to see kind of where Latin American countries come out this year. there was a regional, a pre-CSW regional meeting for Latin America and the Caribbean as a region that had the ministers of gender and sort of related ministers. And they had a ministerial declaration that's actually still quite progressive, has a lot of really strong language on a wide range of issues, both in terms of like the financing for social protection systems, for women's human rights, for reproductive rights, for LGBT rights. So, you know, there's still political commitment there, even with some of the turns that we've seen there. And I think that the Pacific as a region is quite interesting, and that it's, you know, so often overlooked. But, you know, I think of our fellow activists in the Pacific, and in particular those who work on the issues that Jessica and I work on, whose bodies are on the front lines of such a wide range of issues, from climate change to the impacts of trade to sexual and reproductive rights. And so it's also been really heartening to hear the Pacific as a region have a stronger voice in CSW. They definitely did last year, as the Pacific Islands Forum Group had a really strong voice and a strong role to play in bringing up issues that no other region is really willing to take on in the same way. And I hope to see that again from the Pacific this year.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Rachel said. I think the support from Latin America has been a determining factor in the success of increasing recognition for LGBTI rights at the UN. They have states from that region have the credibility because, for the most part, they have good laws and policies in place at the domestic level, but also as a region from the global south, their leadership is able to rebut the argument that homosexuality and transgender rights are a colonial or Western imposition. So they actually have been the leading bloc on a lot of political issues related to LGBTI rights. And so, as you can imagine, OutRight and our friends are very concerned what the recent wave of more conservative political elections across Latin America will mean. So, cross fingers. That said, there's been success in unexpected places. For those of you that followed the resolution on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions in the third committee, I mean, there was a historic moment there, and only perhaps the wonkiest among us caught it. But I think I'm in a room of wonks, so probably you know. But if not, you know, the OIC, so in that resolution, there has been language referencing sexual orientation since 2001, and on gender identity and sexual orientation since 2012. And what happened was that that language is always challenged, and the OIC usually votes as a bloc in opposition to the inclusive references to SOGI. Well, like in this past General Assembly, 4 states from the OIC broke ranks with the OIC, so there couldn't be a bloc position opposing the references to SOGI. And those states were Tunisia, Lebanon, Albania, and Turkey. And it was really significant. And of course it matters enormously because there are LGBTIQ people that live in Muslim nations around the world. They have organizations, they have families, and sometimes they even have relationships with the government. So that was a surprise success. And then I would just say things are really changing in India. And of course the decision of the Supreme Court of India to decriminalize homosexuality in its historic decision last year is a game changer. It's a game changer for the world. My colleague Maria in the back from OutRight and I always say, this is probably the most important legal decision for LGBTI rights of our lifetime. And so to have India's position change actually could have a spillover effect across Asia. I could go through every region and give examples. I would say some of the less defined regions are Asia, the Pacific, and the Caribbean. They vote and support positions differently on LGBTI rights depending upon the issue. But I think
one takeaway that might be appealing is that we're increasingly seeing even conservative governments support LGBTI rights. And that's something I never could have imagined 10 years ago. So there are conservative governments across the mountain states and across Latin America. They're just saying, yeah, well, actually, like, these are still human rights. It doesn't matter. And so, we hope to continue to hold that space.
The India decision came after the last CSW, right?
It did,
Yes.
yeah.
Are you expecting that that will have some kind of ripple effect this year? If you say it's the biggest game changer of our lifetime, I'm just wondering.
It's so new.
Yeah.
It's so new. Some of you may have observed that the Mission of India actually organized an International Human Rights Day event in December in honor of the decision. I mean, can you imagine? That was so significant. And every seat in the room was packed. And the states that showed up were not the usual suspects. They were states from across Southeast Asia. So I hope it's a game changer. If I weren't an optimist, I couldn't be doing this work.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Yeah.
Can you be more specific about the game changer in Lebanon? Can you please be more specific about the game changer in Lebanon? I don't think it's.
The